I started my professional life actually as an actor in the first two series of Biker Grove with Anton Deck. And the legacy of that for me was that I realised I wanted to be a director or a writer and director. So I actually went to Cambridge ostensibly to study economics, but really to do all that with the footlights and that kind of thing. And up until the age of 25, that was my sole career goal. And at 25, I found myself in Los Angeles doing a lot of work over there. At that point, sort of became disillusioned and thought I want to do something different with my life. And obviously, being in America, I'd been through to Las Vegas and was aware of this thing called poker. And thought I'll give it a go. Actually, I thought I'd do it for about 6 months or something. I thought something a bit crazy to do. Ended up doing it for 3 years. And it was doing that taught me what I now talk about and think about, which is how and why and when we take risk. And it was that made me want to set up my own company, which was a media production company, which I eventually sold to Bob Geldof. And so it was the juxtaposition of those two experiences, the poker and the business, that made me realise that they had much more in common than people thought. I think now it's not necessarily passé, but it's quite a common perception. People understand that poker players are strategic investors, or at least they're not gamblers in the traditional sense. But at that time, that was quite a different way of thinking. And so initially I was talking about the relationship between poker and business, and I think gradually over the 10 years I've done this, I've moved away from that to take some things from poker but really focus them on business and what we can learn about that. I realised you could make a living from playing poker the first day I ever saw it, encountered it, and played it. During my sessions, I talk about something called the butterfly effect, the fact that tiny things can have huge impacts on your life. A lot of people have this experience. Someone they've never met before, they've never met since, who said something which changed the course of the rest of their life. And I had this person, don't know his name, he explained poker to me in terms that made sense to an economist. About how every table is a little crucible, a market within which we're all trying to get the edge and maximise our returns on investment. And I just got this. So I immediately understood and realised that you could make a living and a profit. Doing it, much more difficult than understanding the theory. But I resolved on that day to go and do this thing. Again, initially, I thought for a little while, and it was such good fun at first that I ended up doing it for 3 years. The relevance between poker and business, for me, the two are so similar, they just happen to take place in slightly different places. It all comes down to one or two fundamental concepts. Business and poker are just a series of decisions. Investment decisions, resource allocation decisions in a world of uncertainty. That's all we're doing. When we talk about business, you can talk about how to motivate, you can talk about how to build a team, how to sell, but all of those, everything will come down to the decisions that you make. That's ultimately what will decide your success or failure. And poker essentially is just a series of resource allocation decisions where the deck of cards represents the uncertainty of the terrain, the world, other people's feelings and opinions and actions. And what we're trying to do is navigate that uncertainty and get the edge over our competition, because each poker table is like a little market in which we're looking for the inefficiencies of that market. In poker, it's actually other people's bad play, and when we see it, we must exploit it by taking action and having the courage to do so. As a former economist, from Cambridge, poker sort of revealed itself to me immediately. I just saw that you could make a profit and a living by applying actually generic, classical and behavioural economical principles. Poker in many ways is the terrain of business without the office, without the phone, without paying the bills, without the clients, just laid bare. It's what we're doing at a fundamental level. And so for me, it's just like the perfect metaphor and crucible within which to explore who we are as people and why we do what we do. There's sometimes a question, isn't there, about whether entrepreneurs, for example, are made or born. And again, I'm of the feeling that the evidence points to the fact that our brains are not blank slates, that actually, there are differences in us, even at the point of birth, genetically. In fact, there's a strong evidence, for example, that Americans are generically genetically different to the European populations that spawned them, because of course they're descended from the people who got on the boats, who went in search of new adventure. And so what is sometimes a cliche that Americans tend to be more risk tolerant is based on quite accessible science. You know, they are genetically predisposed and therefore culturally more disposed to trying new and different things, some of which will fail. So I think that's definitely true. However, it is also the case that entrepreneurs live and work in different environments to people in corporate life. If you're an entrepreneur, how much of the upside do you get if you take a risk and it works? All of it. If you're working in a huge department, you might get a small bonus. You might not even get that. Actually, incentivization is critical to the decisions that people make when it comes to risk. If you're an entrepreneur or a poker player and you try something and it all goes completely wrong and you're broke, what happens? Well, sometimes the community will lend you money to get back into the game. You know, that's not going to happen if you're working in a department or if the company goes under. So I think, like all things, our ability to take risk and our propensity and our willingness is a function of both of our nature and our nurture, and that debate will rage on. But let's try and think about both if we want to motivate ourselves and others to change. I think, and you might say, well, you would, wouldn't you, that risk is fundamental to the results that we achieve and enjoy in our lives, or our ability and propensity to take risk. Because again, a business is just a machine for taking risk. You might say an individual person is just a machine for taking risk. I just can't think of anyone who is successful, who's achieved, extraordinary things in life, who hasn't at some point along that journey taken risk. This is a really important point. That doesn't mean that they've endangered life or limb, right? It doesn't mean that they've been reckless or dangerous or stupid. So many of my audiences in the first 3 minutes, and so I tackle it at that point, think that risk-taking involves doing things that are unacceptable, and in fact it precisely doesn't. Risk management means defining what is unacceptable at very first stage and asking therefore what kind of latitude do we have before we get to that point. The interesting thing is the answer is usually quite a lot. There's an enormous amount of things between our comfort zone where we spend most of our time and the line of unacceptability, which we should believe is sacrosanct. It all comes down to return on investment. You will get greater returns on investment the more risk you're prepared to take. You will also endure more volatility, more confusion, more discombobulation. But think about the great success stories that we tell, anyone from Olympic gold medal winners to entrepreneurs. It is their ability to deal with that confusion and that volatility and that slightly different standard and style of life that will ultimately determine their long-term success. So the question is, how can we get people in our organisations and teams to be prepared to take more risk? And ultimately the answer has to come back to, well, if not the leadership of those teams, at least an interaction between the two. This has to be a joint effort. You can't just say to people, change what you're doing, without changing the circumstances, the situations, the rewards, etc. I think there's 5, 4, 3, 2. I'm going to pick a 3-stage process, or 3 key things. The first of which is alignment. A for alignment. That is people understanding what it is that they want to achieve, and here's the key, what price they're prepared to pay in order to achieve it. There has to be a downside. There has to be a cost. If any change is going to be enacted, there is going to be a process of confusion along the way. So accepting that price and that cost is a really important thing for that team to do together. The next thing is for incentives. You have to change the incentives. If you want to get people to step out of comfort zone and do more different things, you have to take away some of the fear of the downside, and you have to increase the upside and the rewards for doing so. Otherwise, why would people do it? They're just going to stay doing what they've always done, because as we know, they'll get what they've always got, and if that's not so bad, then who cares? And then the third stage, I think, is D. Aid. You see where I'm going with this. D is for delineate, demarcate. If you think about areas in our world where people take risk, let's think of an idea generation session. Or let's think about Google's 20% time. What do those things have in common? Well, they're delineated. It's a day a week in Google's case. It's the next 2 hours when we're generating ideas. It's not forever, and it's not everyone. It's not let's go mad and crazy. It's within this period of time, or within these four walls, or this team have a license to fail. They have a license to take more risk, and we understand that in the process of that they will fail more often. And that's not great, we don't love that, but we accept that that's going to happen if we want them to engage in that process to get to where we want to get to. So A, alignment, I, incentives, D for demarcate. First, aid. One of the aspects of decision making that I love is the extent to which we're in control of it or not. A lot of speakers are trying to ultimately answer the question why we do what we do, because if we can do that in a corporate context, then we can get people to change. And I think the fascinating thing about decision making is that as human beings, we love to think we're rational, and certainly in organisations, in companies, we love to think we're rational. We've got our spreadsheets, do you know what I mean? We've got the numbers, we can prove a case for it. One of my favourite clients I ever worked with was a member of a big acquisitions team, and he says, yes, Caspar, but we make billion-dollar acquisitions. We'll sit there for days talking about it, and quite soon on the first day, someone will take the report and toss it aside and go, how do we feel about them? Do you know what I mean? Ultimately, all of our decisions go through a filter of emotions. I mean, it doesn't matter that this number on the page is 4,000 or 4 million or 4 billion, right? It's how people feel about that matters. Richard Branson is going to make a different decision with respect to an upside when compared with, someone who's in 40 grand's worth of debt. They're going to make different decisions because their life situations are different. That doesn't mean to say that either of them are right or wrong. They're making decisions that are appropriate to their context. In other words, we are ultimately emotional beings. And what the behavioural economists did about sort of 30 years ago now, which has eventually seeped into our, I think, greater consciousness, is show that we're not rational in the classical sense. We are emotional. But that there's power in that there's a lot of power in our instincts and our intuitions, and that's good. So my key message ultimately is embrace our intuitions, embrace gut level decision making, embrace system one thinking, the old limbic brain, right? Because it's extraordinarily powerful, but use what's unique about our human psyche, use our neocortex, use our conscious mind, use boardroom decision making to probe it, to challenge it, to ask if it's really the right thing to do, and use the two together constantly, and that's how you make great decisions. That's how a poker player makes great decisions. Listen to the little voice, ask if the bias is too far one way or the other, and then execute. I think at the end of any presentation, an audience should feel invigorated. It's a terrible cliche, but motivated. There should be a desire to embrace some of those ideas. But honestly, what I try and do is to stimulate them intellectually as well. Alfred Hitchcock used to talk about the thing that will get them talking on the way to the car park. There should be something about the story that was still a bit of a mystery or what have you. I call it a wrinkle. At the end of the day, we have to accept that 9 times out of 10, people are going to listen to it. Hopefully they enjoyed it. Hopefully they were stimulated. But a lot of people are going to forget about it unless you've really changed like a part of that culture of the organisation such that they want to bring you in again, and they want to really make fundamental change. You've only got 45 minutes. But the wrinkle is crucial, because the wrinkle is 4 days later, someone turning to someone at the water cooler and going, we should talk about that. We should talk about what he said because it stayed with me. There's something about it where life hasn't returned to normal. So I think even more important than as they filter out to coffee, that wrinkle is what will affect long-lasting change.